Hi, I'm Chris.
And I'm Jeremy.
And I'm Fergal.
And we're from Movie Smash.
Comic book movies are having a golden age right now with the MCU.
Movies based on comics aren't necessarily a new thing, but they're a big thing.
Join us every other Tuesday on Movie Smash.
We explore these movies and find some hidden gems.
Every other week, we revisit some of the best.
And some of the worst movies based on comics or graphic novels.
Was Green Lantern as bad as you remember?
Heck no!
Is Time Cop the most accurate time travel movie ever created?
Absolutely.
Was Mystery Men way ahead of its time?
Should they be revisited? Should they be forgotten?
Join us on Movie Smash and find out. Listen wherever you find your fine podcasts.
I want to apologize ahead of time here. If this episode comes off as somewhat rushed and maybe not quite as polished as some of my other work, not to give out excuses here. What I did, if you were listening on or following on in the last few series, I had mentioned how I had planned to do an episode on Louis, who in the era of post-World War II France, which is where a huge chunk of the second season of AMC's TV series Interview with the Vampire sets itself in. So I really, really wanted to do an episode on that, and hopefully I will get another opportunity to do that. But I did pull a book which I thought was perfect for the era. It covered a fascinating series of people who, the founders of existentialism, several major playwrights and authors, and painters, artists. Like, post-World War II France is chock full of an amazing amount of extraordinarily influential artists, writers, playwrights, and philosophers in post-World War II France. And they all lived within just a few blocks of each other, and many of them knew and, of course, interacted with each other. And I was trying, and I got a book which I thought was going to talk about all of this, and it did. However, the book, unfortunately, ended up being less about their achievements and the things that they were doing and the conflicts between communism and other thinking in post World War II France and all that sort of stuff. And instead it became much more about who was sleeping with who, and it just wasn't a satisfying read, and I couldn't tease out the details I wanted to. And I was, kind of pot committed to the book, so I had to just cut it and find this alternative, which I'm going to do. This is what this episode is on. So I apologize. This is a hobby for me, so I'm reading these books at night after work before I go to bed. So I just don't have time to go through dozens of books. And unfortunately, I picked a stinker. And now I kind of rushed through this one to get it out in time. And as it is, it's already a little late. My apologies. And I am already thoroughly into the research for the next series, which is coming along very well. This is a much more reputable book. But anyways, apologies. Let's get to the episode and enjoy it. And let's get going. In the winter of 1765, reading and listening audiences all across France were horrified and enthralled by stories of a wild beast that terrorized inhabitants of the Massif Central. With a physical description that defied belief and the ability to strike quickly, evade detection, and confound its pursuers, the mysterious beast had attacked and killed dozens of people in and around the remote mountainous region of the Gévaudan in the southern province. The victims, virtually all of them women and children, attacked while tending their small flocks of sheep or cattle, died grisly deaths. According to many accounts, the beast of the Gévaudan lunged deliberately for the neck, delivering fatal wounds and quenching its thirst for human blood before feasting on the bodies of its peasant victims. Several of the unfortunates were decapitated, and at least one skull, separated from the rest of the body and found at the edge of a wood some distance from the other remains, was cracked open like a nutshell. Reports of new assaults came with alarming frequency, and by the end of 1765, the beast would lay claim to 60 victims. The northern Languedoc and neighboring Auvergne descended into mass panic. The growing legend of the beast captured the attention of France and much of Europe. The air of mystery hovering over the Gévaudan would attract commentary from such luminaries as Voltaire, Immanuel Kant, Frederick the Great, and the English novelist Horace Walpole. What you just heard was the very opening paragraph from J.M. Smith's novel Monsters of the Gévaudan. And apart from my massacring of the region of France known as Auvergne, and I think I've mispronounced that again, let me give that another try, Auvergne. And apologies to any of my French listeners. I know I'm Canadian and I should be better with my pronunciation of French. But this is a new region of the world for me, and I'm learning how to pronounce it. And apologies, I will try my best to keep it as close to the original French as possible. Auvergne is the region. And why I read this is because we are starting today a brand new series, of course, on our season 2 topic of the real history of the vampires of Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles. We just wrapped up, if you're interested, the real history of the Louis de Pontelac of the recent AMC TV series that set itself in the early 1900s New Orleans with the birth of Storyville and the very start of the jazz era. If you're interested, just go back to the previous series of episodes. But right now we're starting a brand new one this month, and it is on the real life history of the vampire Lestat. And why did I open with a book called The Monsters of the Gévaudan? And that is because if you're a fan of the vampire Lestat or the Anne Rice's Chronicles, you know the vampire Lestat was born in a region of France called Auvergne. And the vampire Lestat, if you're a super fan, you know he has a nickname of Wolf Killer. And that is his nickname because in 1778, at the age of, I think, 20, Lestat goes and kills a pack of wolves in the region of Auvergne. And this is in 1778. The opening paragraph I just read to you was from 1764 to 1767. Although it specifically mentions 1765. But this is because the Beast of the Gévaudan was a real-life historical event that happened in the region of Auvergne, literally 13 years before Lestat is 20 years old and kills his pack of wolves in the very same region. So I thought we would stick with this story to start our series off on Lestat, because we can learn about the region of Auvergne where Lestat spent his early years living, what was it life like for the people there, and what I am going to cover today, the Beast of the Gévaudan, was, as I said, a real-life historical event that happened in the region, and it paralyzed and the region and fascinated the entire rest of France and especially Europe as well. How this beast terrified it. And not only are we tying it into Lestat's birth region, but also there is, as you will tell, and as I mentioned in the opening paragraph that I read to you, there is a supernatural component to the Beast of the Gévaudan. And yes, it is a real historical event, but the people at the time certainly didn't shy away from tying supernatural qualities to this beast. And so we're going to go through the history of the Beast of the Gévaudan. We're going to talk about the main characters. We'll talk about the beast itself, its description, what did it look like, who was involved in trying to catch and kill the animal, and what happened when they did actually catch and kill the animal, and what did it really look like when we were done. And then we're going to move into our next episode in the series, and that will be pre-revolutionary France, as of course Lestat is up in Paris during the revolutionary era. So we're going to cover that as well. A huge, important event for France and also for the rest of Europe. So this is what we're going to cover today, the Beast of the Gévaudan, which is an honest-to-God, real-life historical event. And we're actually going to kill two birds with one stone on this episode, because not only are we covering the real-life history of the vampire Lestat, we are also going to be covering the real-life history of the movie, The Brotherhood of the Wolf, which also sets itself as a group of hunters dealing with the Beast of the Gévaudan. If you haven't seen The Brotherhood of the Wolf, it's a older movie from, I think, the early 2000s, maybe the late 1990s. It is a good movie if you love science fiction, fantasy, supernatural stuff. I recommend you go find it if you can. It's worth a watch. Otherwise, let's tune in, continue on to the episode, and let's find out what happens with the Beast of the Gévaudan in the region of Auvergne when Lestat was just about an 8-year-old boy. First, I think we should set the stage a little bit before we dive right into the beast. Historian Jean-Marc Marceau, who is a kind of rural historian of France, has documented deadly wolf attacks across France from the late 16th through to the early 19th centuries, showing that between 1590s to 1690s, human victims may have numbered in the thousands. That's human victims of wolf attacks in France in a 100-year period between 1590 to 1690 could likely number in the thousands. If that seems high to you, there's a good reason for it. It's not just wolves were running wild, obviously that's a thing, but there was other things happening that were enabling the wolf attacks to take place. The wars of religion in the late 16th century, and then there's the 9 Years' War that's just at the turn of the 17th century, would have caused really increased incidences of wolf attacks. And I'm not saying that as an expert on wolf attacks. I am reading to you or repeating to you what I have read from the research of this historian on this book, The Monsters of the Gévaudan. And I will put a link to the book in all my podcast episodes for the series. It's a great book, and I definitely recommend you get it. There's lots of quotes in there, quotes from letters, quotes from newspaper articles, official reports, even from the Crown. So there's lots of good stuff in there, and this pulls a whole bunch of stuff in, as well as information from other historians and all sorts of stuff. So I am not speaking to you as an expert on wolf attacks. I've said many, many times, I am not a historian or an expert or anything like this. What I am is a huge fan of history. I'm a nerd for history, and I'm sharing my love of history with you. And so I'm just repeating to you the fascinating things I've read and learned about. So we have the wars of religion in the late 16th century, the 9 Years' War, which was at the end of the 17th century. And this caused thousands of people to be killed in and around France. So there are battlefields filled with bodies, which carrion would take off. Of course, love to eat that stuff. Wolves would find easy pickings for meals to make for full bellies when you just come across a battlefield full of thousands of bodies. And so this would have, in addition to just kind of rabies infections, which was a huge problem, that would have caused increased wolf attacks as well. So you have all these things happening that would kind of give wolves in France specifically a kind of training or learning that human flesh is the thing that we should go ahead and eat. There's thousands of bodies everywhere, and once the bodies start drying up, we can go hunting or we can go find some more humans, which are easy pickings. Mountains and forested regions were also especially vulnerable to wolf predators. That would be because, it's sparsely populated, and forests and mountains are obviously the natural habitat for wolves. So there's lots of places for them to go and roam about and make it harder to be hunted down. And at the same time, in these sparsely populated regions, we have people that are running farms which don't produce a lot of food, so they have to rely on animal husbandry and the products from that, either meat or, wool that they would then trade to buy other food, that type of thing. So in and around this region of Auvergne and the Languedoc, we have a mountainous region called Massif Central. It's mountainous, it's heavily forested, and there's lots of little dips and valleys and rivers. It's very rough terrain. It's not a lot of great, massive farmland for producing a lot of food. So there's a lot of little teeny communities all over the place. And within these little teeny communities all over the place, there's a lot of people making a living on animal husbandry. So that's, shepherding goats and sheep and, cattle, that type of thing. And the job of shepherding these animals often fell to women and children. They would take the animals out to pasture and then take them back when they were kind of fed, at the end of the day. And so women and children in these mountainous regions that are sparsely populated, hard to be patrolled, hard to control wolf populations, all that sort of stuff. And then you have these wolves that have for, a few generations learned that eating humans is easy and tasty. And so this is a recipe for increased wolf predation on easily picked on women and children who are doing nothing more than looking after their flock in and amongst these little remote valley areas through the forest and woods and the mountains. And so now that we've set the stage a little bit without going deeply into the history of the 7 Years' War, the wars of religion, that type of thing, which would each need their own series, which are fascinating things in themselves. And if you're interested, I definitely recommend you read into those. But we're going to try and keep a tight focus just on the Beast of the Gévaudan this episode. So, with an understanding of a little bit of the background of wolf attacks, how common those were, and the type of terrain and region Auvergne is in the Gévaudan, which is a little sub-region of Auvergne. So, with that understanding, the first victims of the beast that are reportedly attributed to the beast started around the summer and into the fall of 1764. The first victim was in a region called Margeride, a 20-year-old woman from the village of Approche. She was decapitated. The skull would be found after a week, just random people going through the thing. So, can you imagine the trauma of your daughter or wife not coming home, and then the next day you go out to go and find them, and you find a decapitated body, and then a week later you find the actual head. 6 additional children between the ages of 6 to the early teens would also suffer attacks. Not all of them fatal, but all of them getting very serious wounds to the face, neck, and head. 4 of the 6 would survive. By kind of mid-October, there was another 10-year-old boy whose head was decapitated in the attack, and his torso was shredded in the attack as well. So these initial assaults started capturing the fascination of newspapers. The printing press was becoming quite common, especially in France. The French had developed a culture of reading and letters and scientific pursuits and newspaper articles. So even if you couldn't read, there was often people who would share papers amongst themselves. There'd be public readings of newspapers. So this was a cultural thing happening. So papers were very, very getting very, very popular across France. There was there's money to be made there, and this Beast of the Gévaudan is an attractive article to gather more listeners and subscribers to your paper. So these attacks started. What made them unique was the decapitations, not just animal attacks, wolf attacks. It was the decapitations which started this initial fascination with the Beast of the Gévaudan. The earliest articles who described the beast as the nature of the beast as somebody that preferred to, quoting the papers, quote, seize its unfortunate victims by the nape of the neck, choke the life out of them, and drink their blood before separating the head from the trunk of the body, end quote. This is what's being printed in the papers. Very sensationalist reporting and representations. The beast is drinking blood, draining the victims before decapitating them. Already at the start, the beast is being given this kind of supernatural, vampiric type quality right here. Drinking blood. Hey, hello, Vampire Lestat. And the supernatural qualities associated with the beast would only continue to grow. And it's not just because of the beast. Wolves in general had supernatural qualities still associated with them, often by the peasantry. Fairies and things like this are still. Yeah, of course fairies don't exist. Ha 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 ha. That type of thing. So there's still even in the age of reason, quote unquote, there's still, as we all know, even today, people who believe in supernatural fairies and forces and things like that. And if you're one of those people, great on you, perfectly fine. But the region of the Auvergne, by the nature of it being very, very rural, these communities are all segregated from each other. There's not a lot of education that's being given to the peasantry. They know animal husbandry, they know farming, they know how to make a fire, they can, knit and spin wool, that type of thing. They can do what they need to do to survive, and their education is the church, aside from that. So there's not a whole lot beyond that for this peasantry. And in the countryside of Auvergne, the feudal system is still very much in effect here. I think it's called the seigneurial system is the term that applies to France and this region in this era. So even though this is happening, the beast is getting this supernatural qualities associated from it from the sensationalist reporting, but also the local population themselves are beginning to attribute supernatural qualities to the animal in general. In 1765, the Courrier d'Avignon would relay a local report from the Auvergne about a boy who had contracted a fever after the beast looked him in the eyes. So, this is the animal casting a spell or a curse just by looking at you. Some supernatural power associated just from being near the beast. And of course, we can't be talking about wolves attacking people and supernatural qualities without touching on werewolves. It wouldn't be a podcast about the intersection between history and popular fiction if we couldn't bring up werewolves at some point in the podcast series. Well, of course, the Beast of the Gévaudan is getting that attention applied to it as well. Werewolves were known at the time to have a strong preference for the fat and taste of young children. This is according to popular lore as well as recordings from other people who are writing about the lore of the region. In 1599, Jean Beauvois de Chauvancourt, this French people have the best names. Jean Beauvois de Chauvancourt, he had reported that a man was recently brought to trial for lycanthropy in the city of Angers. He was coated in pungent devil's grease, and I don't know what that's a euphemism for, but that's what was reported. The quote-unquote werewolf, a man by the name of Jacques Rollet, was giving off a telling odor so stinky and rotten that no man of the world could approach him. That's a direct quote from Jean Beauvois de Chauvancourt. In 1765, a broadsheet, that's a very shortened form of a newspaper, a one-sheeter that came off a printing press. A broadsheet reported details from the scene would note that one young girl who had encountered the Beast of the Gévaudan was practically knocked over by the breath that was stinking and rotten. So associating the smell of stink and rot was naturally part of the attributes that belong to a werewolf. And werewolves could cast spells. So this is like the boy who caught a fever just from a glance at the wolf, the beast. So we can see supernatural qualities are getting quickly attached to the beast even before any real action is being taken, although the beast is killing a lot of people so far. These weren't the only supernatural qualities that would get attached to the beast. The beast was often reported as having sparkling, glowing eyes, extraordinarily long claws, giant canine fangs, and also the ability to stand up on its hind legs. It had a tail that could knock people over. It was reported to be the size of a young calf. That's quite larger than any wolf. So we can see the beast is getting all these attributes attached to it to give it these supernatural abilities, which, from these people who survived attacks would only include, increase the drama. This is a traumatic thing happening. And when somebody asks you, geez, how big were the fangs? Well, something that just tore into you, those fangs are the biggest thing you've ever seen. Did it smell bad? Yeah, it smelled bad. It was the biggest animal, it was as big as a baby bull, that type of thing. It reared up on its hind legs when it attacked me, things like that. So this gets attached to the beast, these supernatural abilities. It could give people fever, it could stand up on its hind legs, it had glowing eyes, giant claws, fangs. It smelled like the rotting stench of hell, that type of thing. And not only was all of this part of the look and attitude or attributes attached to the beast, it also did not look like a normal wolf, not according to the tales that would get evolved about how it looked. As I mentioned, it was reportedly about as tall as a calf, so like a young bull or young cow. That's a pretty tall animal. It reportedly was black or had dark fur with a lighter band or like a grayer band or a white stripe reported to come down its back, so like hair kind of standing up. It had a very broad face and kind of a short muzzle. Didn't really look like a wolf, not according to the people that had seen it and survived. It reportedly had 6 claws on each paw. And of course, those were very long, long claws. The sixth thing that was kind of very, very important because no wolf has 6 claws on its paw. And, if you are listening to me describing, an animal that's larger than a wolf, it's got, dark fur with a lighter stripe of fur, kind of like raised hackles that go down from its back all the way down to its tail. It's got a short, powerful tail. It's taller than a wolf. It's got wider face and a kind of little bit of a shorter muzzle. If you're listening to me describing this and you're familiar with African animals, you might be thinking I'm describing a hyena, because hyenas look a lot like this, especially if you're trying to compare a terrified French peasant's description of an animal. You might start thinking, oh, that's kind of sounds like a hyena, and then maybe you're asking leading questions. And a terrified peasant is, yeah, I look like that. Yeah, I look like that. You understand what I'm talking about. So the theory began to evolve from some of the higher ups in the government and the local nobility that it's not a wolf. Maybe it's a hyena, an escaped hyena from someone's private zoo, or that was on a shipwreck, it was going to someone's zoo, that type of thing. A immature lion was another theory of what the animal might look like. Given its ability, it was reportedly pouncing on people and sneaking away. It had attributes that aren't really attached to wolves. Wolves hunt in packs, they circle people. They're not just pouncing on them, sneaking up, and that's what the beast did. So these are kind of things that are crossing through the French countryside, making its way into Paris and some of the other cities, and being reported and sensationalized and printed in these broadsheets, which are then sent and distributed across the rest of France and picked up in Europe and England and other places like that. So this is getting sensationalized and transported as a story all over Europe, about this strange animal. And of course, we have these other people who are wealthy and more educated and have traveled to Africa, gone to zoos, seen hyenas or seen lions, and they're coming up with their own theories about what the beast is. It's definitely not a wolf. It is a hyena. It is a young male lion. Things like that. They're trying to find reasonable explanations to apply to the sensational descriptions that are making it to them through the news and, trickling across the countryside. So these are the theories that are evolving as to what this beast is. And in the meantime, young women and children are still getting attacked, and many of them are dying through the successive weeks. Now, some of you may be thinking, especially if you're a competent hunter, maybe as a hobby or as a profession, why aren't you just going out there with guns and hunting this thing down? That certainly did come across the minds of several people. However, the law in France prevented peasantry from owning weapons. So the only weapons they would have had available to them would be pitchforks, shovels, the ability to maybe jury rig a knife or a cleaver to the end of a broom or a stick to make a kind of makeshift spear. If you had a rifle, you were probably, and no doubt many people still had rifles, or they'd have muskets at this point in time. But still, even then, they would have been loath to kind of publicly go out with them because it was against the law. And if the local seigneur or his men caught you walking around with a rifle, well, that was a one-way ticket to jail or worse. So the only thing peasants could do is, you're armed with a pitchfork while you're out there. Or, why aren't more and more people going in groups to these things? Because life still has to happen. And when you're a poor peasant, the men were out doing other jobs needed to try and earn what money they could, and the women were doing these other still important jobs, trying to keep the flock alive, spin wool, do that sort of thing. So they're torn for lack of choice and have nothing to do but to trod forward and hope that when you're taking the flock out, it's not you who's next on the menu of the Beast of the Gévaudan. Despite the law, the local lord of the Auvergne region, a man by the name of Moncon Lafont, he made an exception to the law locally and allowed anybody to arm themselves to be able to hunt down this beast. Which is great. The law's now lifted, but again, the law's been in place for quite some time, so it's not exactly like all the peasants are suddenly, oh, the law's now, let's just kind of pull the cloaks out and everybody pull out their muskets. Making it legal is one thing. Actually having peasants in all these remote locations with muskets is an entirely different thing. Muskets cost money. They're expensive to keep and maintain. So Moncon, the military commandant in the region, he made that exception, allowing all inhabitants to arm themselves in fall of 1764. So that's the fall of that first years of attacks. In the following spring, Lafont redoubled his efforts trying to arm the rural communities, but he was rebuffed by the local government. Peasants were forced to rely on staves, sticks, like I said, jury rigging knives to sticks to kind of make a spear or a bayonet, that type thing. And of course, there's the other end of the story. Arming peasants is one thing, but I don't know about you, but I've never had to face down a charging beast that when it glanced at you caused a fever and had a stench that rotted with hell, who could rear up on its hind legs and was the size of a bull. If I ever had to face down a charging beast of the Gévaudan with demonic glowing eyes, I would be terrified. And of course, that's what many of these peasants were, very reasonably so, and how most of them were armed with nothing more than a pitchfork or a pickaxe or, a shovel. This is what you're trying to defend yourself against a werewolf with. And in late 1764, a group of peasants was armed with exactly that, shovels and pickaxes. They were clearing brush out in the woods when some hounds they had with them alerted and then gave chase to a wolf that was spotted. Thinking it was the beast, the hunters, quote unquote, instead of chasing after the animal armed with their weapons, apparently got so excited by the opportunity, they dropped their weapons and chased after the dogs that were running after the wolves. The wolf, sorry, not wolves, just singular. They managed to corner the animal in a lake. It got on a rock and it was kind of hiding there, and they had nothing to do but to attempt to stone the animal to death by throwing rocks at it until they managed to kill it, which they did. The local seigneur gave them, the hunters, a reward of 6 livres. They praised the peasants for their fearlessness, but of course that did not stop the Beast of the Gévaudan. That was just another wolf. It wasn't the beast. And in late October, 2 more children were killed, confirming everybody's speculation that the wolf that had been previously killed was not the beast, and that he was still very much alive and terrorizing the Auvergnat. This didn't stop the local peasantry and the local seigneurial nobility from continuing to try and organize efforts to hunt down the animal. After the beast was tracked or located to the parish of Saint-Aubin, an innkeeper named Mercier managed to work with a group of locals. He was one of the few people who had firearms. They surrounded the forest where they thought the beast was, and they began kind of beating the bushes, walking through the forest, trying to flush the animal out. And at one point, an animal did emerge, and it passed by 2 of the hunters who happened to be armed. And quoting the report now, quote, "The first fired from about 10 paces. The beast fell from the force of the blow, but picked itself up. The second then fired from the same distance, and it fell again. The 2 hunters and several peasants rushed forward, believing the beast to be dead, but it recovered once again and fled towards the woods, moving with a faltering gait and more slowly than before, yet still faster than its pursuers. It absorbed yet another shot as it entered the woods, though this blow did not bring it down. When it reemerged, a hunter fired again from about 50 paces. Again the beast went down, but recovered as before and retreated into the woods. The party searched until nightfall without managing to find it again." End quote. The beast survived 2 shots from muskets at basically point-blank range, 10 paces, if you believe the story from the report. And survived maybe a third. If it hit or not, we don't know. But of course, the first 2 seemed to definitely hit the beast, dropped to the ground, and was limping away, but still faster than its pursuers. And if you're maybe asking your head, how does a wounded animal outrun pursuers after being shot twice. Just remember, it's this mountainous terrain filled with forest. It's, rough terrain, and it is also the middle of winter, so it's very tough for people to move around in any amount of snow. Try to imagine doing it through rough mountainous terrain. This surviving the attack would only encourage more legendary mythical qualities to be attached to the beast. It's impervious to lead, after being shot, that type of thing. Other people, later in the report, they speculated maybe the muskets weren't loaded properly, maybe they weren't actually fired accurately. They're using smoothbore muskets at the time, so not very reliable for aiming. In any case, the local Seigneur Lafont, he was very suspicious that the wounded animal somehow still managed to run faster than its pursuers. But anyways, this is the legend of the beast grows through this failed attack where, supposedly now bulletproof. The increasing supernatural qualities attached to the beast, of course, would trigger the rationalists in France, people like Voltaire and other kind of natural history, natural life type people would try to find reasonable, quote unquote, reasonable, modern to their time, relative to their time, natural descriptions or understanding of why the nature of the animal that is the beast. It's a hybrid between some animals. That's why it looks weird. They're trying to describe or rationalize the beast and its attributes in terms of the natural world as they understand it. But of course, we're in a world where religion is very much an important part of daily life, and it wouldn't be reality if the local religious leaders did not try to find some way to help give an answer for the nature of the beast. And that took the form of the Bishop of Mende, a man by the name of Gabriel Florent de Choiseul Beaupre. Pardon me, I'm going to try this again. Gabriel Florent de Choiseul Beaupre. Man, French people have awesome names. So he was about 70 years old when this happened, and he's the bishop, the Comte de Gévaudan, the most powerful seigneur within the region. So when the bishop of the region spoke, he's the most powerful feudal lord within the region and also the most powerful religious authority in the region. So he's got two big powers of authority going for him. So when he speaks, people listen. He issued an official mandement to all the parishes in the region in which, quoting the author, he offered his diagnosis to the Gévaudans' affliction. He blamed the scourge of the beast, of course, because we're talking about a Catholic bishop, on the spiritual failures of the people of the Gévaudan region themselves. It's their fault, your sins are bringing the beast upon you. That's why it cannot be killed. It's a spiritual thing, and you cannot battle a spiritual animal with musket balls and pitchforks. You can only battle that with your faith and by coming to terms with your sins, and that type of thing was the argument he was putting forth. So this is happening here to only kind of throw more chaos into the mix of the beast and the best way to approach dealing with the beast. This is the most powerful seigneur in the region, the highest religious authority in the region, telling them exactly what's going on. And that comes in the tail of hunters who shot the beast twice from point blank and failed to kill the animal. So you can see that might be something that would sway a lot of the people in the region away from trying to hunt the beast and instead turn to more spiritual ways to address the beast. Now, during the winter of 1764, a man by the name of Jean-Baptiste Duhamel, who was a dragoon captain, was given command of the hunt for the beast in the region. A royal kind of decree to go and let's deal with this beast now. It's becoming, all the rage in the news. Jean-Baptiste had more going for him in this story than just the fact that he was the captain of the dragoons. He has a personal connection to kind of pride and honor and martial arms and that type of thing, because I mentioned at the start the 7 Years' War is in the background of this. Not only did it leave a lot of dead bodies laying around France for wolves to chew on and get a taste of human flesh, but Jean-Baptiste's either father or uncle or somebody like who's a close but senior relative of his was in command of a French army that was involved in a disastrous battle, and I believe he was retreated, or he failed to engage when ordered to, or when he should have, and it led to a massive, humiliating loss for France in this battle. So Jean-Baptiste has a cowardice attached to his family name, and he's made it his mission to kind of rebuild the honor and status of the Duhamel family name. And he, through this, had been managed to become a dragoon captain, even in spite of the dishonor, shame of his relatives in the 7 Years' War. But this is a psychic scar on the identity of France in general, but also really to any French military professional, and especially on Jean-Baptiste Duhamel, whose relative was in command of the forces during this shameful engagement. So he's got three things kind of weighing on him for being in charge of this hunt. And that seems to have led him to make some claims of success that would cause problems. He thought, I'm going to go here and I'm going to deal with it. It's going to be done in 2 weeks, a month tops. It's just a wolf in some, I've killed wolves before. How bad can it be? Not realizing maybe that he's maybe never been to Auvergne and seen the Massif Central region. When he gets there in the middle of winter, he's gone from, nice warm southern France to basically the Swiss Alps of France, the Massif Central. It's part of that chain. So he's gone up into the mountains where weather and snow is deep and miserable, and it's not flat areas that's easy for horses to go around or people to track through. So you got deep snow, crappy weather, and rough, uneven terrain, mountainous, woods and stone, and villages kind of desperately all over the place. So he's set himself up for failure right from day one with his haughty attitude towards how easy it would be, which, at least according to the author of The Monsters of the Gévaudan, was probably due to this kind of psychic shame on his background from the failures in the 7 Years' War that was just a decade previous. And as Duhamel tries to hunt down the beast and runs into failure after failure, either horrible weather, his attitude causing personnel conflict with trying to organize hunts and letting the beast escape because of his own professional failure in leadership and blaming people, Duhamel is constantly writing back to, his higher ups and other people as his, 2 week timeline turns into 2 months and multiple failures. No sightings, or when there are sightings, nobody's able to get a shot off. This is what's happening to Duhamel through the winter in this horrible terrain and weather, and he's kind of falling on, trying to fall back on reasons for why the hunt is failing. Why is it dragging on so much? So he starts laying in to the fact that this is no mere animal. This is definitely a supernatural beast. It is something that is beyond a normal wolf. And that is why it's taking so long. It's not my own professional failures. This is an animal unlike anything anybody has ever seen. And Duhamel does many things to help reinforce this. So, he's writing multiple letters to his higher ups explaining kind of the extravagant mitigating circumstances, not only of the weather, but also of how crazy this beast is. It's not a wolf. It's way not a wolf. And in order to help reinforce the thinking that this is not a wolf, he actually commissions an artist to draw the animal based on his own description. And I've used that as the cover for this episode so you can get an idea of what that is. And he has copies printed up and he sends them to all the higher ups back to Paris, France, to the court, so that everybody can see that it is definitely not a wolf. We're not dealing with anything normal here, and that's why it's taking so long. If it was a wolf, this hunt would have been over just a couple of weeks ago. So this is one thing he's doing to help cover up his failures, or describe mitigating circumstances as to why the hunt is taking so long. And the second thing he does is he leans into the sensational journalism that is surrounding the hunt for the beast. At first he was confident, it's just a wolf, we're going to deal with it. But after his first few hunt fails and he's got to come up with some excuses, then this leaning into the myth that had been building starts encouraging kind of a feedback loop. One of the people that Duhamel will provide reports to is the editor of the Courier, or one of the reporters of the Courier, which is a paper popular in France in this era. A man by the name of, Morina, is a sensationalist writer. He's digging into this. He's not afraid to embellish the reports that he's getting. And so, he's not, this editor Morina, he's embellishing and personalizing reports he's getting. And Duhamel is feeding him reports as well for failures. So the two of them are feeding off each other to help convince the public that this is not a normal animal, and B, sell more papers, and C, let Duhamel continue to have his command and not get removed in shame like what happened in the 7 Years' War. So to give you an idea of what this Morina writer of the Courier is doing, liking to punch up the events. In 1765, a report came to him which was published in the paper as, quote unquote, an official report. He reported in suspenseful terms of an attempted rescue of a child in distress. Quoting the article, in the last week of December, in the woods by the village of Saint Martin, the beast had spied a young girl of 12 years and prepared to throw itself on her. The poor child, having noticed the attacker, ran towards her father, who was nearby, crying, "Help me, father! The beast is here! Protect me!" The terrified father, having no weapon other than a large staff, ran to his daughter and picked her up by one arm, while with the other he fended off the beast for at least a quarter of an hour. As fatigue set in, the beast failed to relent. However, it seemed that the father's efforts would be to no avail. The beast would have taken her away if a group of horned cattle who had been grazing near the same woods had not come to her aid. According to the newspaper author, the father relayed the details of the story to one Monsieur de Corbières, who was a knight of the Order of St. Louis and first magistrate of our city. Whether or not Monsieur de Corbière existed, whether he was a real knight of the Order of St. Louis and the first magistrate of our city, that's up in the air as to whether or not it's real or not. Again, this guy's known for punching things up, stories that come to him, adding color. Mornay would publish at least one article a week, usually two, from the vicinity of the Gévaudan throughout the month of January, more than any other editor. And of course, many editors picked up the story as well. Several of them would pick up Mornay's own stories, punch them up, add their own color and flair, and then republish the story their own. So adding more sensational qualities to the story. And while the sensational stories in the letters may have swayed some of, the general population, it didn't do anything for the confidence of the French court, who were surprised that it had taken so long. They agreed that there was probably something exceptional happening there, but they were still very much of the belief that it was just another wolf, maybe a large wolf, maybe several wolves. But the French court didn't think much of it other than whatever the beast was, they wanted it stuffed and returned to them for inspection. And so they became disheartened or disappointed with Duhamel's lack of progress. Again, people in the French court, probably not a lot of them have been to Massif Central in France to see in the middle of winter what the place looked like. But of course, they're not understanding the horrible weather that's happening. And Duhamel isn't doing himself any favors with his attitude trying to organize the local peasants into the large hunts that he's trying to manage. Unknown to Duhamel, though, the French court had already made other opportunities or other arrangements to try and deal with the beast after Duhamel's own favors, regardless of the weather, regardless of difficulties managing the peasants, whatever it was. The French courts basically, it's your fault. Don't stop blaming the weather, stop blaming other people. So the French court puts up a large bounty for anybody to kill the beast, trying to draw hunters, professional hunters, into the region to just get rid of it. And also, they send a man by the name of Jean-Charles Marc-Antoine de Vumel d'Anneval. Man, French people, again, just got the best names. I got to say it again. Jean-Charles Marc-Antoine de Vumel d'Anneval. Pardon me, my apologies. I'm trying to work through this, but there's a lot of hyphens in this guy's name. Jean-Charles Marc-Antoine Duvumel de Nanneval. So I'm going to call him Denneval. So we're talking about the new hunter. Denneval is his name. Denneval is from Normandy, Upper France, if you're unfamiliar with it. He's a well-respected hunter, and he's rumored to have killed hundreds of wolves in Normandy on his own. Denneval brings his son with him, who's also another professional hunter, also another military man. And they also bring with them professional bloodhounds or hunting dogs that they've trained to hunt down wolves. Now, Denival and his son have, if we thought Duhamel was having a bad problem handling the local peasantry, Denival is dialed to 11 with his attitude towards the local French peasants in the Ardennes. Denival arrives in early spring to kind of take command of the hunt, and rather than get right to the hunt, him and his son just chill in a local chateau while they wait for weeks for their hunting dogs to arrive. Why it took weeks for their dogs to arrive when they managed to arrive when they did, that's one of those things that's up in the air. A question about Denival and his son's competence. They bragged constantly about the hunting abilities of their dogs and how it was going to be just fine when they started the hunt. Duhamel is still there while Denival is there. And he's trying to organize these massive hunts. Denival and his son instead want to have, just a very small hunting party, go out with the dogs and then not drive the animal away, rather kind of hunt it down that way. And there are still several attacks. People are still dying, and Denival and his son are sitting in the chateau waiting for their dogs to arrive while this is happening, refusing to go and deal with it. So they quickly get an attitude or reputation from the local peasants of being haughty, arrogant French nobles who don't care about what's happening. It doesn't inspire any of the locals to help participate or work with them. Again, Denival and his son also massively underestimate the roughness of the terrain they're dealing with. And Duhamel is also frustrated with these people who are far more haughty than he was, and also being very dismissive of him, everybody's experience, and trying to offer support and assistance. And they have epic failure after epic failure as well. The Denimals, despite their hot talk of having professionally trained hunting dogs and such, were no more successful than Duhamel. And Duhamel at least had somewhat won over the locals because he was perceived as being active in trying to do something. The Denivals were just seen as prissy, haughty French nobility who didn't know what they were doing. And after 4 months of failure, King Louis the 15th personally got involved, and he sent to the region his own personal hunter, Francois Antoine, who had the official title of gunbearer to the king. After a few weeks of being less successful, the king sent Antoine several of his own professionally trained hunting dogs. Antoine, at least at the start, performed better in the eyes of the locals, certainly much better than father and son Denival. And even though he had several months without any success at all, he was at least organizing regular hunts and attempts to track the beast down. He had earned a reputation of, politeness when he was dealing with the locals, participating in a religious procession in August with the locals, going to church with them. He was seen distributing alms to the local poor, and he also funded a fireworks display on the Feast of St. Louis. That's a big religious holiday in France at the time. Although, despite his public-facing efforts to win over the locals, privately, Antoine, in his correspondence to the court and to his friends on the failure of the hunts, blamed the locals. According to Antoine, quote unquote, most of them believe it is a witch. Antoine's efforts didn't fool everyone, though, locally. During one such hunt, Antoine had a local with him, Jean Chastel, and his two sons. They were locals to the region, and they informed him that the area that they were in was swamp and bog free, so he had no fears for his horse and could kind of pursue the wolf as fast as he wanted to. After that, he promptly got stuck in a bog, during which he sank up to his chest and reportedly was in fear for his life. And while this was happening, Jean Chastel and his sons were laughing their heads off at him and his friends. After Antoine freed himself, he grabbed one of Jean's sons by the collar in anger, which prompted Jean and his son to point their own muskets directly at Antoine. After a tense few moments of standoff, tempers cooled. Antoine did go so far as to have Jean Chastel and his sons held in prison for several weeks while he was still there. Late in that same summer, after hearing reports of a large wolf, a female, and several cubs, Antoine organized a hunt. This is on September 19 in the region of Le Chazé. Organizing a large hunt, 40 gunmen, his royal hunting dogs, local guides, Antoine set out. And as Antoine likes to report this story, soon a large wolf that he mistook initially for a donkey was spotted at about 50 paces. Antoine took aim, fired, and he dropped the beast. According to Antoine, he had specially loaded his long-barreled hunting musket with 5 rounds of powder, 1 lead ball, and 35 smaller pieces of shot. The force of the blast was so huge, the overcharged firearm knocked him backwards from the blast. The shot struck the wolf in its right eye. The smaller shot sprayed its upper right side of its shoulder, and, of course, the wolf dropped to the ground. But this is the beast we're talking about. It's supernatural. Something so small as an overloaded musket couldn't be expected to drop this animal, and according to Antoine, quote, "It got up and came towards me. As I turned and realized I had not time to reload my firearm, I looked around." End quote. His comrade, a man by the name of Ranchard, came to his rescue, firing at the wolf as it raced towards Antoine. According to Antoine, the animal continued on for another 20 feet before collapsing to the ground, at last dead. Antoine had the beast brought to a local chateau. Several witnesses who had survived the attacks over the last couple of years showed up, 8 different witnesses to view the carcass. 8 of the witnesses, all of them confirmed it was in fact the one who had attacked them, and I will talk about those in just a moment because there's some questionable thinking about how reliable these witnesses are. But according to Antoine, none of us had ever seen a wolf of similar size. The width and length of its fangs were a sight to behold, and it had the largest paws we had ever seen. End quote. 6 weeks passed on with no further attacks, and Antoine was happy to leave and declare that the beast was officially dead. Yet, as summer turned to fall, more rumors of attacks began to trickle back towards Versailles, and though initially people were loath to call it the Beast, by December 2nd, all hopes were shattered as reports came back of two young boys who had been watching cattle that were attacked, and followed a few weeks later by an 11-year-old girl. Several witnesses confirming the notorious black stripes and leaping movements. As far as Versailles was concerned, this was random wolf attacks, and Antoine is the man who has officially killed the beast. And yet, through the winter and into March, a string of deaths happened between February and March, firmly entrenching fears of the return of the beast. The local nobility in the region were sending letters to Versailles asking for assistance, of which they received little. Instead, the locals turned towards themselves, having spent, the last 2 years dealing with this, learning from Chastel, Duhamel, and what little they learned from the father and son Demel. The locals organized mass wolf poisoning events over which around 100 wolves in the region were killed. They organized their own hunts. And on August of 1767, during one such hunt, our friend Jean Chastel and his sons were in one of these hunts. And it's reported that Jean personally shot and killed a large wolf of approximately 109 pounds. And the locals would celebrate this kill as the official death of the beast. So we have two official deaths of the beast. One by Versailles, in which Antoine, the official huntsman of the king, has killed the beast, and one almost a year later, during which Jean Chastel, a local to the region, was reported to be the one who killed the beast by the locals. So we have two comparisons, and I'm not making a judgment one way or the other, but I do want to talk about Antoine's kill specifically, because Antoine went so far when he took the body to the chateau that I told you about and had several witnesses come and look at it. He went so far as to have it all officially wrote down in what's called the Méron report, and you can access this report. It's available if you want to read in French, or you can get English translations like I had. But I'm going to talk in my last few minutes here just on those results and compare the body of the beast that Antoine killed to what a typical wolf actually looks like. Now, for this next few minutes, I have put away my book, The Beast of the Gévaudan, and I have instead found another paper. It's not a book, but it is another historical book or paper. This one by Arthur Karl-Heinz Tach, and I will put a link to that in the episode description here. This is published in September 2023, so pretty recent. Karl-Heinz did a in-depth review of the Méron report that I just told you about. The author's name is unknown, only that they were a member of the retinue of, quote, Comte de la Tour d'Auvergne. Karl-Heinz does a thorough comparison between what is written in the Méron report versus, as I said, comparisons to wolves of the region. And so I'm going to walk through some of these things because, of course, as I've been going through this podcast, we've talked about bits and pieces of the wolf, its color, its look, its size, claw length. Everybody describes the thing as huge. It was the size of a donkey, according to Antoine. So in the Maron report, it is the actual measurements that were taken of the body. So let's just run through a few of these things, as well as the report of the beast that was killed by Jean Chastel. Sorry, this is the Maron report of Jean Chastel, not Antoine. Apologies. So, three of the measurements of the wolf killed by Chastel give us a head and body length of 121.1 centimeters. Now, comparing this length to two examples of male Canadian wolves, the head and body lengths calculate an average length between male Canadian wolves of 130.5 centimeters. So, not particularly large, at least not compared to Canadian wolves. So it's roughly average in size. The colors and patterns described of the wolves, the black striping, the way it looked, these were actually occur frequently in Eurasian wolves. A white heart-shaped patch was reported, bright spots near the eyes, black bands, the stripes that we talked about. These are all not unusual features. Somebody had reported that it was injured with a bullet to the left thigh, and the examiners found 3 grains of lead in the thigh. Another witness, Pierre, also claimed to have injured the animal in its left leg by a gunshot. Remember, I was talking to you about those people who had reportedly shot the animal point blank, and it got up and ran away earlier on. So these are healed wounds that were found on the body of the wolf shot by Jean. So the people were attributing these healed wounds to earlier reports of people who shot the animal and it got off and ran off and lived. There was also reportedly an old wound, so a scar, an old wound above the lid of the left eye, which appears to have been made by a sharp instrument. This was attributed to the peasant who had apparently, remember that I talked to you about the little boy who attacked the beast with a bayonet? So this scar was attributed to that boy's attack, as proof that the beast that they're looking at is the beast. Now there are some inconsistencies, though, because, of course, one of the reported witnesses who came to see the beast and verify that it was the one that she saw because she had survived the attack, a woman by the name of Marie. She arrived apparently the day after her statement was recorded. So, who wrote down her statement if they're saying she didn't time travel? So we have reports of questionable witness statements about whether or not the beast that was killed and recorded down was in fact the other beast. There's healed wounds that they're attributing to earlier attacks, which may 100% be valid. Of course, the animal was no bigger than an average wolf and had the same expectation of colorage as other Eurasian wolves. So, this kind of raises the question of whether or not all these attacks were by one beast, whether or not it was unique, whether or not it was supernatural, whether it was a single wolf. Many wolves across the region, hundreds of wolves were killed in the last couple of years here as I was going through this. And so, this is one of those things that I wish I could wrap my head around more. I wish I could have spent more time on this, but as I mentioned at the start, I had to rush to get this done for you a little bit in order to get it out, and as it is, it's already coming out a little late. I do apologize. I'll be better next time, but I hope you found the Beast of the Gévaudan, the story of it, fascinating. I strongly recommend you get the book. Again, I will put it in my episode description so that you can get it. It's a very good read if you're at all interested in the history of the Beast of the Gévaudan, all the crazy people that were involved, because the book is very much about the people, less about the beast. So I wanted to start with this because here we have something that's a slice of life of the region that the vampire Lestat grew up in before he became a vampire. He was 8 years old, 8 to 12 years old while this was all happening. So it would have been, and it captured the imagination of all of France. So definitely Lestat and his family were consciously aware of the Beast of the Gévaudan when he was a kid. So thank you very much for listening to this episode. And next month, we are going to be diving in to the next part in our series where we start looking at Revolutionary era France. Because, of course, Lestat lives through that. And that's a fascinating period of time, too. Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show.